That being the case, we'll move on to the third and last speaker, which is Adrian Cunningham, who's going to talk about the memory of the world. This is something which has a very long archival history, but without further ado, I'll leave it to him to describe it to you.
Thank you, Stephen, and Yilma. I wish to acknowledge that we're meeting on Ngunnawal land, and I pay respect to their elders past, present and emerging. I'm assuming my slides will start to appear in due course, but this paper is not about the entire memory of the world, but it is about, nonetheless, a very ambitious project. So it's called Documenting Australian Society. It's a progress report on an initiative of the UNESCO Australian Memory of the World Committee. And I don't think, even though the National Archives of Australia is a participant in this project, I'm not sure why that's there, but anyway, they're a sponsor, I guess. Defining the problem. Can I shut this? It's in my way, so I'll shut it. At present in Australia, documentary heritage holdings are built with limited self-awareness of the greater whole. Decisions about what material should be preserved long-term can be reactive and uncoordinated. What are the consequences of this lack of coordination? What picture does the total stock of Australian documentary heritage present? How representative is it in terms of our rich, distinctive and diverse historical experiences, our changing population, localities and multiple national narratives? Are we making the best use of the limited resources that Australia devotes to the cause of preserving and providing access to documentary heritage? Australia needs an agreed, transparent and defensible process for making hard decisions about what to make and keep across our nation. A vast quantity of documentation is created and destroyed every year in Australia. With the advent of digital technologies, the world now creates more data every year than it has the physical capacity to store and keep. Only a tiny sliver of this vastness is able to be preserved for use by future generations. We accept that only a tiny sliver is worth the effort and expense of preserving. But what documentation needs to be included in this sliver? Are there wasteful overlaps and concentrations? Are there gaps and silences? And we've heard about gaps and silences quite a lot already today. Are we keeping the right stuff? Are there time periods, issues, communities, minorities and phenomena which urgently need targeted documentation strategies? Are there important aspects of life in Australia for which adequate documentation isn't created in the first place and which needs to be proactively documented before all memory of those activities disappears forever? In short, what documentation does Australia really need to make and keep to enable current and future generations to understand, explain, debate and account for our national collective experiences? The work of documenting society is carried out by a wide range of organisations, institutions and initiatives that are committed to enabling the long-term preservation of and access to Australia's documentary heritage, or the documentary component of our national estate. To pursue a nationally coordinated approach to our documentation mission, we need to, in the words of David Bierman, focus our appraisal methods on selecting what should be documented rather than on what documentation should be kept. And in the words of Richard Cox, we need to identify the most salient and important features of contemporary institutions and society and do our level best collectively to ensure that adequate documentary evidence of these features is captured and preserved by archives. You can move on to the next slide. Thank you. So the aim is to achieve better planning and coordination of distributed efforts to preserve and provide access to a representative corpus of documentary heritage materials to help current and future generations understand, debate and interrogate the nature of human experience in Australia. In an environment of shrinking overall funding for documentary heritage programs, it's more important than ever for practitioners nationwide to be seen to be working together to ensure that we spend our limited budgets in ways that help deliver the best possible collective outcomes for preserving and providing access to our documentary heritage estate. From time to time, Royal Commissions into hot societal issues such as stolen generations or the institutional responses to child sexual abuse and forced child migration have highlighted gaps in the available documentation. This in turn has mobilised resources and collaborative action to fill these gaps through initiatives such as oral history and indexing projects. While these efforts have inevitably been somewhat piecemeal, they do show what can be done when there is a collective recognition of the need to do a better job of documenting Australian society. What are the diverse and non-mainstream aspects of life in this country that are going underdocumented? Where might such documentation be made and kept, and by whom? The by whom question is just as critical, if not more critical, than the what to keep question. We should not assume that it should be done just by us on our terms. These groups and those groups whose experiences have been neglected, ignored or underrepresented in our efforts to date may or may not appreciate being belatedly patronised by established programs and institutions. Our responsibility, I would argue, is to not invite the underrepresented into our spaces and establishments, but rather to be willing and to be seen to be willing to be invited into their spaces and networks and to provide some advice, assistance, moral support and resources. So a little bit of history. Long-term attendees of the ASA conferences will be very aware that the challenge of documenting Australian society has been a topic of professional discussion for many years. In the 1950s, Harold White of the National Library of Australia was arguing to the Patent Inquiry that the main aim of libraries and archives was to build a systematic record of national life and development. Next slide, please. This philosophy was echoed by Canadian Dominion archivist W.K. Lamb in 1973 when he visited Australia to investigate and report on future directions for the then Commonwealth Archives Office. The vision of there being a coordinated national archival system resembled the holistic total archives philosophy that prevailed and still prevails in Canada and was enshrined in Australian law with the passage of the Archives Act in 1983. Sadly, a combination of under-resourcing and passive opposition to the idea has meant that those provisions of the Archives Act have rarely been a priority for the National Archives of Australia, which has usually defined its role as beginning and ending with Commonwealth records. Documentation initiatives were left to others, such as the Business Archives Council, the Australian Science Archives Project, the Australian Women's Archives Project, and the National Library's Register of Australian Archives and Manuscripts, otherwise known as RAM. Each of these separate initiatives was highly commendable in their own right, but were left to live or die based on the heroic efforts of particular groups and individuals, being isolated initiatives pursued in the absence of any national system of support or mechanism for agreeing and addressing gaps and priorities. Next slide. The phrase documentation strategy entered the archival lexicons courtesy of Helen Samuels, American, who wrote about it in an article called Who Controls the Past in the American Archivist in 1986. Samuels defined a documentation strategy as a plan formulated to assure the documentation of an ongoing issue, activity or geographic area, for example, the operation of the government of the state of New York, labour unions in the United States, the impact of technology on the environment, and so on. In Australia, the possibility of implementing a nationally coordinated documentation strategy was aired in 1992 at the cross-disciplinary National Summit called Towards Federation 2001, convened by Deputy National Librarian Eric Wainwright. Another National Library staffer, manuscript librarian Graham Powell, took up the challenge in an article in Archives and Manuscripts in 1996. Powell surveyed the state of our documentary estate as recorded in the then Guide to Collections of Manuscripts, which had been collated and published for many years by the National Library. He found a preponderance of personal papers of creative writers, academics, pastoralists, businessmen, etc. Correspondingly, he found many notable absences. Notwithstanding the trade union holdings of the Noel Butler Archives and the University of Melbourne Archives, where were the papers of shearers, waterside workers, nurses, factory workers, Aboriginal activists, housewives and European immigrants. In 1997, I gave a paper at the ASA's annual conference in Adelaide titled From Here to Eternity, Collecting Archives and the Need for a National Documentation Strategy. In 1999, Michael Piggott took up the cause in a paper delivered to the National Scholarly Communications Forum Roundtable on Archives in the National Research Infrastructure, titled A National Approach to Archival Appraisal and Collecting. In turn, Piggott's paper inspired Maggie Shapley in 2001 to edit a theme issue of Archives and Manuscripts focused on the issue of documenting Australian society. This issue included articles by Kirsten Thorpe, who we heard from this morning, on Indigenous records, Sigrid McCausland on documenting protest movements, Don Bodle on documenting rural and regional Australia, and Richard Cashman on sports archives. In the same year, Sue McKemish wrote that there was no coherent, collaborative, nationally coordinated, encompassing fourth dimension collection policy framework for the whole of Australian society. So there's been lots of discussion within our profession about this issue over many years. After that flurry of activity in the early 2000s, the issue faded into the background of our discourse until Michael Piggott again picked up the cudgel in his valedictory keynote address on the absence of an Australian archival system, delivered at the 2008 ASA Annual Conference in Perth. In this paper, Piggott proposed 4 rules for any such system. 1, be inclusive. 2, form the machinery. 3, develop a documentation plan. And 4, know what you stand for. Next slide, please. Once again, the issue slow burned for a few years, re-emerging as a hot topic for discussion at 3 successive ASA annual conferences between 2013 and 2015, led particularly by Sigrid McCausland, Kim Eberhard, Colleen McEwen and Maggie Shapley. In the midst of that, I once again wade into the fray with an article in Archives and Manuscripts that revisited my 1997 ASA paper. All of this chatter was very interesting, but it didn't really lead anywhere. There seemed to be consensus that a national documentation strategy would be a nice thing to have, but no one was able to advance the idea in any concrete manner. Sigrid McCausland was plotting with Michael Piggott at Tilly's Wine Bar in Lyneham, here in Canberra, about how to get things moving. At the time, I was a near neighbour of Sigrid's, both of us living in the Brisbane suburb of Annerley. When she was diagnosed with her terminal illness in 2016, we had some intense discussions about how to make sure this idea got some real legs. I made a deathbed promise to Sigrid that it would not die with her and that I would do all I could to get something happening. I moved back to Canberra and resumed plotting with Michael Piggott at Tilly's. Mindful of his second rule from his valedictory keynote, we agreed that the only current avenue of forming some machinery was the UNESCO Memory of the World program. With its national plan-disciplinary approach on preserving documentary heritage, Memory of the World was the nearest equivalent to the long-defunct Collections Council of Australia as a possible suitable sponsor for an initiative to progress efforts at documenting Australian society. We approached the Memory of the World Committee, proposing a national summit to explore whether key stakeholders were genuinely interested in the idea or not, and the committee agreed enthusiastically. So we set about planning a summit which was held in Canberra in December 2018, and David Fricker of the National Archives of Australia generously agreed to sponsor the event. Next slide. So, the invitation-only summit featured 2 invited overseas speakers, Laura Miller from Canada and Mark Crookston from New Zealand, the aim being to let delegates hear about similar efforts in other societies with similar histories of Indigenous, First Nations and British multicultural settler societies. A range of local speakers, including archivists, librarians, curators, historians and social commentators, filled out the program. The aim of the event was to test the appetite of key players for pursuing a more coordinated approach to building a distributed Australian documentary heritage estate that is as representative as possible of the full diversity and complexity of life in Australia. We were quite prepared for the possibility that the answer to our question might be, no thanks, not that interested, or perhaps, nice idea but it's unrealistic and we've got better things to do with our limited resources. And if so, we would have walked away telling ourselves, well, we had to try, but at least now we know that the idea is not going to fly. Next slide. Yeah, we're a slide behind, so you can move on to the next slide. That was Laura Miller and Mark Crookston and Ros Russell, by the way. Okay, so the summit delegates actually endorsed the idea and passed the Canberra Declaration, committing themselves and all their organisations to work collaboratively to pursue a representative national estate of documentary heritage. The first 5 points of the Declaration are all motherhood statements. They summarise the issue and explain why it matters. The remaining points are all action items, and these points can be summarised as follows. One, we need to identify key issues, communities, groups and partners to involve in further discussions. 2, we need to pursue collaborative research into strengths, gaps and weaknesses of existing national holdings, plus models and strategies for improving those holdings. 3, we need to engage with government about policies and funding for improved planning and coordination. 4, the National Archives, the National Library, the National Film and Sound Archive and IATSIS to pursue joint and inclusive leadership for a national system for documentary heritage preservation. And 5, develop a collaborative plan of action. So that was the summit. We had our writing instructions, we had a mandate to move forward. What's happened since then? Since the summit, a small group of summit organisers and delegates, together with some Memory of the World Committee members and others, have been active in discussing the initiative with a range of interested organisations and academic researchers. Initially, we decided that our most pressing need was to initiate some rigorous research to give us a more informed understanding of the current state of documentary heritage preservation in Australia. This research could explore potential evidence sources and frameworks for identifying gaps in holdings and ways of prioritising the documentation of important but neglected or underrepresented gaps, aspects of life in Australia. We felt that we needed a solid evidence base to inform the planning and coordination of efforts, and that research, in addition to inclusive community participation and consultation, is needed to build and test this evidence base. We've had many useful and detailed discussions with a wide variety of academics across Australia from a variety of subject disciplines. All expressed interest and support for the initiative, and very many good ideas and suggestions have been forthcoming. These discussions are continuing, but are yet to bear any fruit in terms of viable research funding proposals that we might submit to the Australian Research Council or some other funding body. At the suggestion of the Memory of the World Committee member Rachel Watson, we agreed to broaden the focus of documenting Australian society, the initiative, to place more emphasis on fostering grassroots community-led documentation efforts. Rachel proposed a self-selecting communities of practice model, a bottom-up approach to documenting society that could complement and enrich the more top-down, planned and coordinated approaches pursued by peak bodies and national documentation frameworks. An excellent example of such a community of practice is one coordinated by AusStage that is documenting the performing arts in Australia. This is a great model for other potential engagements with grassroots practitioners, including community heritage grants recipients. In 2020, we established a steering committee to guide the initiative into the future, and which reports to the UNESCO Australian Memory of the World Committee. The steering committee, whose initial focus is on pursuing the action items from the Canberra Declaration, includes or consists of members of the parent committee, in addition to representatives from the ASA. Mind you, that position is currently vacant following the departure of Lisa Gibbons, so we're looking for a new ASA nominee. If you're interested, talk to Nicola, and we'd love to have you. Kirsten Thorpe represents Indigenous perspectives, so echoing her contribution to Maggie Shapley's theme issue all those years ago, and representatives of key national institutions named in the Canberra Declaration. In future, we hope to broaden the membership of the steering committee to include representatives from Glam Peak, the Australian Library and Information Association, and NASLA, that's National and State Libraries Australia, and individuals who can represent grassroots community heritage practitioners and users. Also in 2020, with the support of the National Archives, we organised a webinar on the highly topical issue of documenting COVID-19 in Australia. This event featured Commonwealth Chief Health Officer Dr. Brendan Murphy, pandemic historian Anthea Hislop, freelance curator Lauren Carroll Harris, Scott Stevens from the ABC, Jay Weatherburn from the Digital Preservation Coalition, Digital Humanities and Media academics from ANU and Queensland University of Technology, and speakers from different national collecting institutions. A video of this event can be viewed on YouTube. And also there is a Documenting Australian Society webpage that can be found on the Australian Memory of the World website, which has links off to all of these resources. Next slide, please. Earlier this year, we commenced the strategic planning process facilitated by Shane Brainard, and one outcome of that process has been agreement on vision and mission statements. So our vision is nationwide holdings of documentary heritage that are inclusive and representative of the wide diversity of Australian experience and endeavours, past and present. And our mission is to enable that vision, we will foster an ecosystem of research, planning and coordination that supports documentary heritage programs, practitioners and communities of practice, and that engages broadly across Australian society. On Friday this week, we're running another webinar over the road at the National Archives that is co-sponsored by the ASA and the National Archives. This free event has the title Honouring the Stories of Struggle, Reassessing Australia's Records of Disadvantage. The event will have two sessions, one asking the question what evidence should be preserved and the other asking the question what evidence is being preserved. The first session will feature care leaver Dr Frank Golding, Robin Sutherland from Uniting Communities, genealogist Danielle Lautrec, and UTS social policy academics Eva Cox and Professor Noreen Young, the latter speaking on Indigenous perspectives. And the second session will feature speakers from the National Archives of Australia, the National Library of New Zealand, and Jenny Jerome from Tasmania, in addition to Cassie Finlay talking about privacy issues. Other models, we're always very interested in seeing what other people are doing around the world in this kind of space, because we're not the only country that has the challenge of selecting and preserving a representative body of documentary heritage as a systematic and inclusive record of national life and experiences. I've already mentioned Canada and New Zealand as sources of inspiration for our efforts. New Zealand is a particular inspiration for our work. There is in New Zealand explicit acknowledgement that they have a thing called a National Documentary Heritage System. Their National Library, the Archives New Zealand, Te Papa and their Film and Sound Archive work together to exercise leadership and provide support for this system and its associated Preserving the Nation's Memory work program called Tahuhu. Senior positions have been created in these institutions with responsibility for the liaison, coordination and strategic relationship management that the program includes. The relevant minister requires all budget bids to demonstrate how they impact on and relate to the documentary heritage system of New Zealand. Next slide, please. As an example of this system at work, there is the We Are the Beneficiaries project led out of the National Library of New Zealand. This project is run on the principles of co-design, involving representatives of the welfare beneficiary groups and individuals in New Zealand whose stories and experiences the project aims to document. And I'm delighted that Jessica Moran from New Zealand will be speaking about this at our seminar on Friday. Next slide. In the United States, there's a brilliant initiative called Documenting the Now. This project is funded by the Mellon Foundation and Princeton University Library, and it's governed by the Shift Collective, which aims to achieve equity by design. Excuse me. This project develops open source tools and community-centred practices that support the ethical collection, use and preservation of publicly available content shared on web and social media. Documenting the Now responds to the public use of social media for chronicling historically significant events, as well as demand from scholars, students, archivists and others seeking a user-friendly means of collecting and preserving this type of digital content. Next slide. So, future steps. The Documenting Australian Society Steering Committee will continue reaching out to new partners and stakeholders in an effort to broaden our reach and sustain our efforts. We'll keep a close watch on similar initiatives in other countries and we'll seek to emulate good models and initiatives. With the new government in Canberra developing a new national cultural policy, we hope that there will be space in this policy for the kind of coordination, efforts and outcomes that is our vision for documentary heritage in Australia. Funding for the initiative is an ongoing challenge, given that the UNESCO Memory of the World program has no reliable source of income. We are most grateful therefore for the sponsorship of the ASA and the National Archives for events such as Friday's seminar, for otherwise there would be very little that we could accomplish. Of course, we'll never achieve a state of perfection or documentary heritage nirvana, regardless of how well we cooperate and regardless of how clear and compelling our vision might be. We'll always have gaps and inconsistencies, not the least because of the inevitability of funding shortfalls, political complexities and the irreconcilability of contestable and contingent perspectives and worldviews across our domains. Indeed, it is the nature of this complex and contingent beast that I think we will and should always be constructively dissatisfied with the results of our collective efforts. Continuous improvement will always be necessary. But just because we might never achieve perfection doesn't mean that we're not all obliged morally and professionally to work together as well as we can to do the best job we can possibly do, given all the constraints and realities mentioned above. It would be unfair for future generations to condemn us for trying but failing to achieve perfection, but future generations would be absolutely entitled to condemn us if we don't even try to do something about the challenge, or worse, pretend that the problem doesn't exist. Collectively, there is a need to develop and operationalise frameworks and mechanisms that can help the making of hard choices and agreeing and allocating responsibilities. These frameworks and mechanisms need to be evidence-based, defensible, coherent, realistic, inclusive, holistic, contestable, transparent and capable of evolving. The work needs to be informed by a thorough understanding of the current state of Australian documentary heritage holdings, its strengths, weaknesses, gaps and overlaps, our baseline if you like. More importantly and far more challenging, it needs to be informed by knowledge of and some level of agreement on what is important and distinctive about the diversity and complexity of life in Australia that has to be reflected in our documentary heritage in order to help current and future generations interrogate and understand Australian society. Our responsibility is to ensure that important aspects of Australian life are not neglected as a result of well-meaning but disjointed, fragmented and ad hoc efforts pursued in the absence of a holistic regime that provides support and resources to diverse, community-driven documentary preservation programs. The objectives of the initiative are ambitious, if not audacious. It will not be easy to make progress, and we must avoid the temptation of trying to boil the ocean, but rather make progress in small and incremental steps. But if something is important, the fact that it may be difficult is no reason not to attempt to advance the issue, and we will stand to be condemned if we don't even try to achieve success. Gallant failure is preferable to a lack of action, or indeed a lack of acknowledgement of the importance of the issue. I encourage each and every one of you here today to take an interest in our work, and I'd very much like, if there's time, to hear your thoughts, ideas and suggestions, questions and criticisms. Thank you very much. Time for questions? Okay, so does anyone have any comments, questions, critiques, suggestions? Yes.
So it's striking to me that...
Hang on, just wait for the
sorry.
microphone, thank you.
Hello? Yeah. So it's striking... my name's Nick, thanks. So it's striking that the Documenting Now initiative in the US has private philanthropic money behind it and based at a major well-to-do university. Can parallel kind of funding structures and administrative sort of things be put in place here, or at least tried?
Yeah, look, that's a good question. I'd like to think so. I mean, I in my dreams, I'd like Australia to have an equivalent of the Mellon Foundation. Yeah, they've funded a tremendous amount of really important projects in North America. And in fact, it's probably worth exploring whether the Mellon Foundation would be even interested in funding something in Australia. There might not be anything that would prevent them from doing that if they were sufficiently excited by our proposal. Yeah, whether there's an Australian equivalent of the Mellon Foundation, I don't know of one, but if anyone does know of one, please tell us, because we need... I mean, UNESCO is a huge international organisation with quite a bit of money. In Australia, the Australian National Commission for UNESCO survives on a pathetically small amount of money. They have a quarter of an FTE in the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And years ago, they used to have an annual grants program that we used to apply to for funding, and that gave us a bit of money back then, but that hasn't run for years. So effectively, UNESCO in Australia has no money at all. So it sort of sounds good that our project is sponsored by UNESCO, but in terms of finances, it's zero help. So getting some wealthy philanthropic organisation to come along and get enthused about this would be fantastic. I'd love to see that happen, but there's no obvious places to go that I'm aware of. Yes, down the back.
Thank you very much. A suggestion, if you've not already tried it, is the Fox family in Melbourne, the Lindsay Fox family. His wife, Paula Fox, is a very keen antiquarian book collector, as is their second son, Peter. The parents and the three surviving sons are all billionaires. They're very philanthropic, right. And it could well be worth your while to make contact.
Yeah, okay, thank you. That's a great suggestion. We'll look into that. Thank you. Time for one more question. Are there any questions from our remote attendees? No? Okay, any further questions from the floor? If not, okay, thank you very much for your attention.
I think that's it. Thank you very much for all attending, and we'll see you here tomorrow morning. Have a good evening.